Hello and welcome to AWS On Air. This is our first time being live here following Andy's keynote. We've got an exciting lineup of content throughout the 3 weeks of AWS reInvent. My name's Nick Walsh, developer advocate here at AWS, and joining me for many of these keynote recap sessions, or all of them actually, is my partner in crime over here, Rob Zhu. Rob, how you doing today?
Hey, Nick. Great to be here.
Yes, great indeed. So, we have a particular title for this session, and that is called Keynoteworthy. This is a session in which we will recap what just went on in the keynote. We have 5 of these throughout the 3 weeks. But before we get into the exciting launches that Andy talked about today, why don't we tell everyone at home a little bit about AWS On Air and what they can expect from the live stream track throughout these next 3 weeks?
Yeah, so as a component of reInvent, we're going to have live video coverage, customer interviews, feature highlights, launches. You've probably heard that reInvent is our opportunity every year to kind of take all of the work that we've done and really kind of put a summary on it, make sure people who need to know that information can have access to it. And I know that on the one hand, that's awesome, but on the other hand, that can be kind of information overload for a lot of folks. So what we're trying to do with this show is to help give you another channel through which you can organize that and discover what matters. And the really the interesting element of it is that it's live. We've got a program schedule that we can post in the resources that you can have access to, but it's going to be programming that runs every day for all of reInvent.
Yeah, exactly. We have a blog post that we'll be using as a golden source of truth to update all of the latest launches, when we'll be having some of those deep dive interviews with service team members, updates with the customer sessions as they come in, and most importantly, or not. There's no reason to play favorites here, Rob, but something I'm very excited about is those localized recaps, right? So for the first time, we'll be having live content in a variety of languages from developer advocates just like you and I, many of which will be familiar faces to some of you around the world. And they'll be delivering it not just in various languages, but also in your time zone. So we understand in years past, reInvent was in Las Vegas, Nevada, and that could be difficult to try and stay awake and keep track of all of the announcements. So we're trying to bring it a little bit closer to where you, the customers, are, just like philosophy behind a lot of the services here at AWS. So very, very excited about that this year around.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, first ever digital reInvent. A lot of things are new. A lot of things are, we're doing them a different way now. But think of it this way: one great thing is you don't have to hop on a shuttle just to make it right to the next session at the different venue. You can tune into all your sessions as they are released on the schedule, as they're organized in your calendar.
Yeah, exactly. We've got our live schedule here that you'll have to work around a little bit, but hopefully we've got some content that will keep you excited for coming out here. And then all of the other content that's available on demand through, the session catalog will be there for you to peruse at your leisure. This is 3 weeks. Many of you are going to be at work. So we're excited to be able to add this flexibility this time around to be able to sort of allow you to build your own schedule and not have to forego too many things.
Yeah, definitely. So, shall we get into the recap?
Yeah, so we're here with Keynoteworthy. That's what we are. You and I are here to talk about. We just watched the Andy Jassy opening keynote. As he does every year, he announces a large number of new services and important features. But before he announced the first one, there was a bit of a state of the cloud overview. Did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So every year, Andy gets up there and tells us about kind of the developments that he sees from his perspective, and he really has a bird's eye view of everything that's going on in the cloud computing industry. And one of the things he called out immediately is this, the Gardner report, Value Partners, that really kind of assess the state of the cloud market. And AWS is still a leader in this space, unsurprisingly. He noted that these unique circumstances that we're in this year, they've caused major disruptions across a variety of industries and markets. And interestingly, that has led to an acceleration of cloud adoption. A lot of these companies are looking for ways to kind of cut on costs, innovate more quickly. Really, kind of all of the elements that we've seen come together with cloud computing, but almost driven to a overdrive. And that was a great segue into this situation where he said, you know, companies that are cornered into reinvention tend to fail more often. And I thought that was really insightful because reinvention is not just a buzzword, right? Companies can talk about all they want about how they want to invent and simplify and build and innovate, but really it takes a lot of of specific practices and skilled execution to walk the walk. And I thought that he had some really good points in his 8 keys for reinvention.
Yeah, there are 8 here. We'll try and get through them really quickly to summarize. But I think the core components of cloud computing that are so valuable in a rapidly changing environment, the ability to have elasticity in your deployment size, pay as you go pricing, the ability to scale up or down to arbitrarily any size. This is a core tenet to being able to respond not just to vast increases in traffic or changes, but drastic changes on the opposite end too, if you want to be able to scale down. And we see that the agility that cloud offers you, namely with these AWS services, enables you to be more resilient and agile to respond to these changes in the environment, for in both predictable and unpredictable ways, right? So going down the list here, first of which we have leadership will to invent and reinvent. I think this is something that we've probably all felt at some point or another, right? The desire to sort of work bottom up is to make change is certainly valuable, but ultimately for some of the mass scale of these transformations, having true leadership buy-in is critical to be able to actually not silo your infrastructure, to be able to do this in the most effective way possible. Again, being agile oftentimes involves the removal of red tape or blockers internally, and top down sort of management in this way enables you to sort of have alignment across different teams.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, the leadership will there is not just to kind of, again, I think what I really liked about the way that Andy laid out these keys to reinvention is how deep they go and how much of a sense of responsibility leadership needs to take when enacting these kinds of things. And so, for example, with the will to reinvent, it's not just stay at that level in an abstract sense, but it's also challenge the data that you're being told about what customers care about, because as you mentioned, large organizations tend to build up different channels of information, how information flows back and forth about what matters to the customer, what's succeeding, what's failing, and that leaders should challenge those notions. Um, I think the next one is really really hits home for me, which is that acknowledge that you can't fight gravity. When large industry trends are afoot, you really can't resist it. You resist them at your peril, right? And the perfect example he gave was with Netflix, when Netflix realized that they needed to cannibalize their own DVD rental business because the world was moving online to streaming video. It must have been an incredibly difficult decision for the leadership team at Netflix to make, because what they were doing was taking everything they knew and saying, this is not the path forward anymore, right? Think about the amount of soul searching that needs to happen. This is not easy stuff. Even though Andy kind of can only spend a limited amount of time on each one of these are not easy by any means.
Exactly. And to Andy's point around there being such a small number of companies that can truly exist and thrive at massive scale for long periods in time, a big part of that is sort of, in a way, inertia, right? In what you've described, so much of the work at a company could have been put into a particular method or product to solve a certain problem, that there could be either formal or explicit or implicit barriers to wanting or being able to make that pivot. But we see that from an infrastructure perspective, AWS helps to sort of remove those formal blockers that self-managed infrastructure could.
Yeah,
Um, I talked about the first point before being, the leadership will to reinvent and sort of top down, but I'd say it's just as important to have bottom up desire to learn and change, right? With these new technologies or with these new implementations for infrastructure that you'll be looking toward, at the end of the day, you can have all the leadership buy-in in the world, but it's still critical to empower and have software developers who are, again, your boots on the ground with building your application, with maintaining it. If they are willing to learn, and we here at AWS try to empower all those folks through training, certification, and so on and so forth. I mean, even hey, in this way, Rob, I think you and I, with some of the content that we'll be doing this week, our core audience is probably the software developers sitting at home or sitting at work watching this, trying to talk a little bit more about the launches. So the more familiar they are with these tools as solutions to their problems or tools in their toolkits, we think, and Andy certainly thinks as well, the more equipped the company is going to be able to be to reinvent their applications in their company.
yeah, absolutely. I mean, there has to be that will and drive kind of from top and then throughout the organization. It cannot be a top-down initiative. It has to happen at every level of the organization, and that's what's really challenging, because oftentimes you have, what Andy described this kind of old guard mentality where this is the tool we know, this is the way that business has been done, and therefore it is the default way moving forward. But we're seeing more and more often with the pace of innovation and the accelerating pace of innovation in a lot of different areas, from infrastructure to industry verticals, that that's really not a safe assumption to operate on anymore. But uh, the counter to that, it has to be balanced with making sure that all that talent that's hungry to invent and reinvent needs to be counterbalanced with this really strongly rooted notion of why we're doing any of this stuff, right? I mean, I think as nerds and as engineers, we tend to get sucked into the technology. We're like, oh, this is so cool because this piece of technology has, ACID compliance, or has strict linearizability, or eventual consistency, or whatever. Let's really, like, as our job one as engineers is really to say, hold on a second, this technology is a means to an end, right? It's a means to achieving a business end, and if you lose track of that, you end up building the wrong thing. And maybe that works for a couple of years, but overall that's a tax that you as an individual, and then your team, and then your organization, your company cannot pay. And so that's another really good call out from Andy, is that we have to be constantly focused on solving real problems. What is the real reason why we're doing this? Really kind of think of the technology as a means. If a better means comes along, you use that tool, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I'll set the stage for I think what we can expect over the course of AWS on air for the 3 weeks. But the example that you didn't give, that I'll just go out there and say is, we all like that new shiny object. We would love to learn it and build with it, but Kubernetes may not be the solution to everything, right? This philosophy is deeply ingrained here at AWS and at Amazon. We call it the working backwards process, and that always starts with the customer and the experience they're going to have. And technology should be a means to an end, just like you said. So, balancing sort of the desire to learn and innovate, not just in how you're solving a problem, but really root that in exactly what you're delivering for your customers. Um, and so part of this comes down to, another point, which was speed. Speed disproportionately matters at every stage of the business. Speed never stops becoming important. No one ever said, "Oh, I want you to ship features slower," or "I want fewer features to be shipped." I want fewer features as an end user, right? And no one ever also purposely says we want to ship features slower on the internal side. It often becomes sort of tied to one of the other points he said, which was don't complexify. When systems and internal processes, especially on the infrastructure side, become overly complex or start to take on technical debt of various forms, this then results in a slower release cycle and less features that are shipped for customers. So a lot of these points that Andy mentioned are sort of foils to one another, and I think it's important because sometimes you can't achieve one of the positive forward-looking goals without solving or finding ways to avoid some of the backwards looking ones, like accidentally complexifying.
Yeah, yeah. The complexity thing is really interesting. One of my favorite books on this topic is Domain Driven Design by Eric Evans, and half of the book is dedicated to this concept called domain modeling, where really the team has to have this really crisp shared understanding of what problem their business or their product or their application is actually solving. And it needs to be so crisp that they can actually write down the glossary of terms and what they mean, and be able to describe the problem in plain language. And in turn, he calls that plain language that describes the business problem the ubiquitous language. And the idea is that the software is just automation of the ubiquitous language, plain and simple, right? And what that then turns into is the business domain logic, right? This is when you see this in all these architecture diagrams. There's usually something, some piece of some block diagram that's like, this is where the business logic goes. That's actually what that means. That's where the business domain rules are enforced. And what's really interesting about this is when you talk about these problems, what you will find is that the incidental features, like, do we use HTTP? Do we use TCP? Do we use UDP? Are we using SQL tables? Are we using rows and columns? Like, those are actually not part of the ubiquitous language. The ubiquitous language is things like, once a customer books a ticket, they have 2 weeks to cancel it, right? And those are they operate at a different level of abstraction from the technical details. And I think that's another element when you talk about complexity is, yes, it's important to make sure that that ubiquitous language is as crisp as possible, but it's also important to make sure that the underlying technical details don't unnecessarily bleed through. Because if you don't manage this, I mean, think about it this way: if you and I can't even communicate about what the requirements are, what hope do we have of building software that efficiently solves it? Right? I think that's really one of the core problems here.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's it's not always purposeful for why this happens. I think there is a totally reasonable explanation. Andy had the quote at some point in that opening deck where he said, when all you have is hammers, everything starts to look like a nail. And especially as software engineers, you can really only solve problems with the set of skills and tools that you have in your utility kit. So oftentimes when you propose a set of problems, people disproportionately try to use the tools that they're well equipped with, rightfully so, right? And this bleeds really well into sort of the next point, which was using the platform with the broadest and deepest set of tools. So understandably, it is very difficult for any individual to have a complete mastery of every single AWS service. But I think anyone who's gotten their feet wet and have used it for some sizable amount of time have come to learn that they are, the learning curve is generous in that when you start learning certain foundational services like S3 and CloudWatch, that knowledge sort of compounds and enables you to use other tools more effectively instead of having to use isolated individual tools and then having to relearn certain or build yourself foundational services that would then support them downstream. And so, when you're trying to decomplexify, if you enter into an ecosystem like AWS's set of services, knowing that there are end-to-end integrations within the platform for the broad set of needs that your application may need to serve is very comforting for the time that you will spend investing and building your infrastructure on that platform.
Yeah, and I think that has a really nice, it plays really nicely with this idea of how to not complexify things because, like you said, people have special tools. Yeah, you have to be mindful of what they're good at and what they can deliver. By having a platform that has such a broad and deep offering, you can push off some of that incidental complexity onto the infrastructure. And the perfect example is with our purpose-built databases, which we will talk about in more detail throughout the remaining sessions. But one example of this kind of, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, is to use your relational database for everything. And I think this is like it's almost like a rite of passage to make this mistake. But one of the things that people quickly do realize is that, hey, a relational database is actually not very good for storing time series data. It
Mhm.
really bloats out the tables. It slows down your queries. It causes all sorts of issues if you have a large amount of data and you're thinking about how to shard this thing and scale this thing. But when you're operating on a platform like AWS, you have purpose-built solutions, the right tool for the job, as we like to say, right? And you have solutions like TimeStream, which is a purpose-built database for time series data. Think about how powerful it is to be able to reach for that, and it's ready to go, battle-tested, scales as you need, and pay for what you use. That's super useful, and it really helps you make sure that you are focusing on your business.
Yeah, exactly. And to your points about focusing on the business, it shouldn't always be the end engineer's decision to have to sort of think all throughout the entire stack of the organization and make those decisions, right? There needs to be some sort of cohesion between the end user that's implementing and some of the strategy at the top level or the C-suite. And we got to actually hear from a few of these people. So first up, I believe we saw Lori Beer, CIO at Jpmorgan Chase, talking about the massive scale of their transactions, the sheer number of customers that they have, the sheer number of assets. I think it was 28 trillion assets, 6 trillion payments per day, 54 million customers. I don't think it would ever be reasonable to expect a bottom up approach to sort of just organically spawn an architecture that would be able to handle all of this, right? At that sort of scale, you truly need this top down sort of buy in to be able to make sure that you have no sort of faults across your organization or no true bottlenecks because I can think of a bunch of different ways in which those assets could be queried and you don't want one service sort of having the blast radius to blow out the rest of your, let's say, your transactions, right? Just like the BI application blowing out your core service for transactions. That would be terrible. But with JP Morgan Chase having, I think she's quoted 35,000 developers, that's a massive number. Top down approach to that management, it seems like a necessity to me.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, try to visualize that. That's enough developers to fill a stadium, and how you keep them all productive, how you keep them all, unblocked, and have giving them the tools that they need to operate at speed and securely with workloads like these that are mission critical, right? I mean, Lori mentioned that JP Morgan is a critical piece of financial infrastructure globally, and this is a company that cannot fail. um, and we mean that in the best possible way. So, absolutely, everything you said makes total sense here, and it makes sense why they're using a platform like AWS.
Yeah, and I'm going to I don't mean to contradict myself, but there are certain transformations that certainly need top down buy-in and management. But uh, one of the points that cannot be missed is the ability for an individual developer to have outsized impact on their organization's infrastructure. One of the ones that I would point to here is from Jerry Hunter, Senior Vice President of Infra and Tech at Snap. He talked to us about how simply switching from Graviton to Graviton 2 from on their EC2 instances saved them, I think it was up to 40% on their cost. So that could be something as simple as the ops member that writes the configs for the instances that some of your infrastructure is deployed to could simply make that switch. No further application code changes required in certain instances, and they could simply save 40%. That's pretty wild to think about in the extreme the vast world of how much code is written and time is spent on this work. One simple infrastructure change due to a new feature from AWS can have 40% cost reductions. Oh, Rob, I don't know if you're muted. Can't hear you. Well, while that's being worked out. So yeah, that was the opening to Andy's keynote, talking about these transformations, state of the cloud, just the general trends that we've been finding. But the most exciting parts of the keynote, as they usually always are the new launches that Andy mentioned. And so these were divided into a set of categories. Naming them really quickly, we're going to go through all of them. So I believe our goal here will be to cover each of them as a brief overview. We won't go too in depth. Oh,
Can you
I
hear me?
think I can hear you now. Yeah.
Okay, just switching a mic over here. Sorry about that, everyone.
It's truly a live stream, folks. We're doing it live.
This is how you know it's a live stream, because there's no way we would pre-record something like this, right?
Why do you have to say it like that? That sounds so ominous. Like we would purposely do that to throw them off our trail.
Well, yeah, I know. Now we're playing the mind game here. Um, yeah, what I was going to say is Graviton 2, the 40% price improvement, price performance improvement is, it's really hard to overstate how hard it is to get this kind of improvements at this phase in the game. It's truly remarkable. But I think that actually segues very nicely into a whole bunch of compute announcements. And we like to think about compute in kind of three broad categories, right, Nick?
Yep. So we have, I believe that's going to be instances, containers, and serverless. Even though I know there's some folks that have some thoughts on containers and serverless together, but I think that's a pretty fair, not bifurcation, but separation of powers, so to say.
Yeah. So I guess just to call out a couple things that I found really exciting as part of the instances announcement. Um, we had a whole number of announcements here. This being a keynote worthy, we're not going to be able to touch all of them, and I think we'll have plenty more sessions where those are the better places to get detailed information about those announcements. But one thing that jumped out to me is the P4D instance with 400 gigabits of networking. What? That's incredible. What would I even run to max that out? I was actually scratching my head and thinking, like, well, how would I even build a distributed application to max that out? That is insane. And this is the kind of, remember, 400 gigabits per second is between these P4D instances, and we also have this other very, very high throughput instances, like the 100 gigabit instances are already extremely high throughput, but this is 4 times faster than that. So
Yeah,
I'm pretty floored, and I'm still digesting that announcement.
I just sort of looking through all of them. Andy says at the top of this top of one of his slides, the broadest array and of instance types and the most powerful instances. And then the laundry list was fastest networking with up to 400 gigabits per second in P4D, largest high memory instance, largest local storage, most powerful ML training with the P4D, fastest for ML inference in Inf1. Best price performance for consumer graphics applications in the G4AD, the only cloud provider with Mac OS, which was actually an announcement that we saw last night in AWS late night from, I believe that was Dave Brown. and the only cloud with Intel, AMD, and ARM processors. I mean, the headline of broad array and most powerful instances is a good one, but at the end of the day, when you start to sort of unpack it, no matter what your high throughput or your HPC demands are, it really seems like there is something for everybody. And I know it can seem like a lot to keep track of all of the instance types and families and new updated versions. But we did actually get to see yet another one today in the C6GN instance. And so that is particularly a C6G instance with advanced networking, which is what the little N at the end stands for. Um, so compute optimized with high throughput networking. Extremely exciting. And again, each of these instance types are always in result to a customer saying, hey, I use this instance, but I would really like if it could also do this other thing. And so these permutations, at certain times they could feel like alphabet soup to someone that may not be using all of the full array, and not every instance type is ideal for everyone's workload, obviously. But this feedback that we listen to from customers directly drives what instance types we seek to improve or to generate next.
Yeah, and quick note, whenever you're going to be hearing a lot about these new instance types over the course of the next few days, and whenever you hear the C6, the M6, the R6, I mean, the lettering, it corresponds to the purpose, the general purpose of the EC2 instance type, but the sixth generation always refers to an instance that is powered by the Graviton 2 processor. And the Graviton 2 processor is an ARM-based processor, so it is not going to run your x86 workloads natively. You're going to compile those into ARM. Luckily, you'd be surprised how much stuff just works on ARM right out of the box, zero configuration needed. Perfect example is all of your Node.js apps, right? A lot of your containerized apps, they run on ARM beautifully, and that's how you get that 40% price performance improvement. But whenever you see that 6, that means we think that the price performance improvement is so significant that it warrants labeling it as a brand new generation of EC2 instances.
Certainly. This was not a new launch, but worth mentioning is the Inferentia chip that went generally available through the Inf1 EC2 instance type earlier this year. For a lot of companies that are just starting out with machine learning, that training cost can seem exorbitant in the beginning, but in the fullness of time or over any sort of sizable production experiment with machine learning or workload, inference oftentimes completely dwarfs training costs. And so we have invested a significant amount of resources to be able to improve and lower this cost for customers. So we were excited to get that out earlier this year, but we have some even more exciting launches from this keynote with Andy. First of which was the Habana Gaudi based EC2 instances. This is going to offer a 40% price to performance improvement ratio over GPUs for EC2 training. So traditionally, folks are used to using GPUs to parallelize their training. There are bindings for this in a lot of the common machine learning frameworks, but now offering a 40% reduction over sort of the previous best in class GPU EC2 based training. So again, cost savings for something that could be cost limiting for organizations to start getting into in machine learning. That's always one benefit. But again, for customers that are already performing machine learning training, a way to simply have 40% more money in your pocket at the end of the day, perform that training less expensively, or with the same amount of money, run additional epochs, what have you. So very exciting. But that was not the only. Training launch that we had. I thought Inferentia was very exciting when that was announced, I believe first 2 years ago at reInvent. But this year we announced Trainium, which is a machine learning training chip custom designed to deliver the most cost-effective training in the cloud. So similar to how Inferentia was announced and then ultimately became available as an instance type in the Inf1 instances, AWS Trainium, from everything that I've seen so far, seeks to bring the same benefit to the training side with, again, custom silicon from Annapurna Labs here at AWS. And so if you're used to using the Neuron SDK with Inferentia, that should work right out of the box with Trainium. And this is available on EC2 instances or in Sagemaker. So all of the places you're already doing machine learning, Trainium should be meeting you right where you're already at.
Absolutely. Popping up one level in the layers of abstraction. We're going to move on to containerization, containerized applications. And here, those of you operating containers on AWS, you've probably known this for a while. We have three broad offerings in this space: EKS, Elastic Kubernetes Service, ECS, Elastic Container Service, and Fargate. And one thing that Andy alluded to was, with the rapid rise in popularity of Kubernetes, what would customers make of these solutions? Would they all gravitate toward EKS by default, or are there a viable number of workloads that find a home in ECS and Fargate? And the answer is that it turns out that customers, especially customers who are just starting out with container-based infrastructure, a lot of them go to Fargate for its simplicity. Fargate, by the way, is our serverless container offering. I don't think there's anything else quite like it out there. But then ECS has its own set of benefits because of its deeper integration with the rest of the AWS APIs and services. So again, I think this is another case where you want to take a close look at what these offerings do and choose the right tool for the job.
Yeah, and if we go back to sort of the promise of containerization, it's build once, deploy anywhere. If users of Docker sort of have heard that time and time again, right? And while folks that have known containers that have then come to AWS have found a lot of comfort in ECS and Fargate, um, this name of Amazon ECS Anywhere and Amazon EKS Anywhere, these newest launches, sort of fulfill that prophecy, right? It's not just that you can use containers anywhere, but it's also, hey, these orchestration tools and these deployment methodologies for managing your infrastructure in ECS and Fargate, or rather in ECS and EKS, the ability to now run those orchestrators in your own data center, in either now some sort of hybrid solution, or running it entirely on prem, and having that be, if I heard it correctly, open sourced, is extremely exciting. I know lots of fans of containerization have been excited about this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the API thing cannot be overstated, because this is what, if you think about it, if you're building automation around, spinning up clean environments for every deployment, having multi-stage environments, all of that requires really good API support, really good documentation. Once that's set up once and you have a good pipeline that's ready to go, that's a really sticky workflow. And what we're hoping to do with ECS Anywhere and EKS Anywhere is to give you that same experience, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud. And that way, that does not become a limiting factor for you later on.
Yeah. One thing I would mention here is also, it's not specific to containers, but this is not a new trend. The ability to offer APIs, either whether it be the ability to more easily mock and do local testing, or the ability to have something like Outpost, right? Folks love services from AWS, and sometimes there are requirements to have it on prem. Outpost sort of delivered on that. So with ECS Anywhere and EKS Anywhere, we see this with bindings for container orchestrators and container services. But I think this is something we can probably expect to see across the larger categories, or the broader categories at AWS.
Yeah, absolutely. So moving on to serverless, and again, I think you mentioned some really interesting debates between containerization versus serverless. We're not here to resolve that for you. That could be quite an interesting conversation on its own, and we have some really great lineups, some really great content. I really suggest you take a look at the catalog. A lot of great sessions on both. But with serverless, we're continuing to make improvements to Lambda. Lambda, one of our most popular services, now has 1 millisecond billing intervals. That's incredible. Before this, by the way, we build in 100 millisecond intervals. So now if your application takes 30 milliseconds to run, you get billed for 30 milliseconds instead of being billed for 100 milliseconds. And what I like about that is that gives you all the incentive to make your application as blazing fast as possible, right? Get the
And
container code done, and then you're saving money.
and I'm going to go a step further here, to for folks that may not be familiar with Lambda. Oftentimes there are multiple ways to implement Lambda into certain architectures, but one of the most common ways that we see it is an event-driven architecture, where there's an event trigger, let's say an upload of an object to Amazon S3, and that should trigger a Lambda function to perform some sort of processing, and then after it's done, it stops, and you're only billed for the seconds of compute that are used. One of the most exciting bits about this launch is, I say this on all of our shows, Rob, but when you can put more money in my pocket and I don't have to do anything to achieve that, that's one of the best wins in my book, right? That is an example of AWS investing and innovating in a way that I just save money over time. And this isn't simply an improvement to the service where it became faster. I think this is a better delivery on the promise of paying only for what you use. If we had the ability to easily bill everyone by the millisecond, we certainly would. It's a difficult technical challenge, but the Lambda team certainly diving deep on this one to deliver this for customers means that they are truly only paying for exactly what they use.
Nick, I want to challenge you on that notion, though. Putting money in people's pockets is actually quite difficult, and people don't really receive it well. I tried to do this at the Trader Joe's the other day. I snuck around and tried to put quarters in people's pockets, and they didn't react really well at all. Like, they don't want money in their pockets. I think it's
Yeah,
totally
I,
wrong.
I don't know. That's a shame. I mean, it's maybe if you just went to the checkout counter and simply lowered all of their bills, they would have been more willing to accept the money. But just handing out the money, that's a little more contentious.
Yeah. Okay, so on a more serious note, Lambda container support. This is huge. I mean, customers have been asking this for a long time, pretty much since the inception of Lambda. They were like, well, okay, it's serverless. Can you just run my container in Lambda for me? And the answer is now yes. And that is incredibly exciting, incredibly exciting. But I think what that's going to do is to create all sorts of more microservice proliferation. Nick, what do we have to help customers that are trying to wrangle their microservice architectures?
Oh man, you teed me up so well for this. So, with the proliferation of microservices that we've seen, but especially now with Lambda, we have the launch of AWS Proton. This is a fully managed deployment service for managing your organization's microservice applications. So, when we're thinking about sort of the end-to-end life cycle here, you're going to want everything from defining your microservice stack to publishing it, selecting exactly where the microservice, what stack the microservice will belong to. You can enter configurations parameters such that you can have a microservice that's the deployment is a little stateless. You can have multiple iterations of the microservice with different parameters. You then obviously want to deploy it and update and maintain. So truly from inception to, or declaratively, having your configuration for your microservice implementation all the way to keeping it alive and well in production is now going to be able to be centrally managed through something through AWS Proton. So very, very exciting. And again, supporting both containers and serverless applications, namely like Lambda here, I would imagine, helps to really sort of smooth this interaction between platform and dev teams. I know this is another conversation that I'm sure is it is hotly debated on Twitter. And, you want to avoid sort of chucking code over the fence and having someone else operate it on your behalf when someone else wrote it. There's a lot of challenges with that. We won't have time to get into them here, but sort of bridging like creating harmony between your development side and your ops side, or simply being able to have those responsibilities more easily managed if a single team is both developing and monitoring and operating their code. Is obviously a good one, right? People look at microservice architecture diagrams and they look a little scared compared to monolith diagrams sometimes, but in reality, the architecture diagrams of microservices are simply a little more honest, I would say. And pretending the complexity doesn't exist is by no means reducing the complexity. So Proton will certainly be a breath of fresh air for a lot of teams that are managing microservices in production.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm always reminded of when we look at the microservices trend over the recent years is how much it's drawn a clear line of delineation between compute and the business logic versus storage and persistence. And speaking of storage and persistence, we have a whole bunch of exciting announcements in that space. Nick, you want to give us a quick overview of what you found to be the most exciting?
Yeah, we'll kick things off here with elastic block storage. So traditionally, elastic. Well, before I get into elastic block storage and the particular launches, I think it's important to sort of set the stage around the amount of data that exists in the world and that the trend of that, which again motivates some of these newer launches, right? So the stats that we saw in Andy's keynote were that more data is created every hour than in an entire year 20 years ago. So to this point of longevity of companies' success when it comes to technology, there is no option but to consistently innovate. And on the second side, being more forward looking, more data is estimated to be created in the next 3 years than the last 30 combined, which would include this year and next year, and the year after that, or the past 2 years, and so on. And so, anticipating the amount of data that will need to be stored, but also transacted upon, is extremely important. We saw a little bit from SmugMug, some of the earliest users of, I believe it was S3, and terabytes of data and objects 14 years ago sounded extremely scary, but we've exploded to, certain companies have exploded to exabyte scale nowadays, right? So again, sort of on this trend of innovation with Elastic Block Store, we see the new GP3 volumes for Amazon EBS. This is a 20% lower cost per gigabyte with IOPS and storage provisioned separately. So this is if you're familiar with databases or managed data services from AWS, this is a really big one, right? Just because the amount of data you need to store increases doesn't necessarily mean that the amount of the profile of your transactions against it scale in an identical manner, right? I may have a lot of data that I want to put in, but I may not be accessing it more frequently, for example, right? And by separating these, it enables you to more adequately right size what you're paying for. So you're not over provisioning on one of the two attributes just so that you have enough performance for one of the two.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it's important to mention that these cost savings are coming to you where you don't have to do anything. If you're continuing to use GP2 or GP3 volumes, you're getting that cost savings and that performance improvement just right out of the box. And it's a great example of how even the services that are not necessarily being highlighted as new announcements, they're continuously being improved upon in a transparent way. No API breaking changes for you. It's just better, cheaper, faster, more reliable. But of course, that's not to the exclusion of new features. We've got plenty of those. The other one in the block storage space is the IO2 Block Express. And this is basically a SAN, a storage area network for the cloud. And it supports up to 256,000 IOPS with a throughput of 4,000 megabytes per second. That's pretty intense. And again, as with all of our other services, you can see that this elasticity is a huge element of what makes the cloud so powerful. And so you can scale it out on demand, pay for only what you use, and you can also specify policies to back this up to S3. And this has never really been possible before for storage area networks. As Andy mentioned, this is another area where we've seen customers struggle with how to manage and scale these things out, right? I mean, and in many ways, this is an intuitive problem. All of us have dealt with a problem where we're running out of hard disk space, or the hard disk is not performing at the level of what our applications demand of it, and it's a really painful process. Well, what if we could just make that whole problem go away, right? You want a faster disk? Great. You want a larger disk? Great. You want one that has more IOPS? Great. You want one that has more burst throughput? Great. And EBS is now becoming this one-stop shop for the ability to solve all of these storage bottlenecks.
Yeah, the storage space is so fascinating. I mean, for folks that have been around for a long time, we constantly see this sort of shift. It seems between the transaction or between the bottleneck in the data and the storage world being compute bound, or sometimes being storage bound, depending on how the data in our world grows, the ability of compute to sort of keep up with it. And in the middle, you sort of have the technology that enables you to make efficient use of the two. So, with IO2 Block Express offering up to 256K IOPS with, like you mentioned, 4,000 megabits per second, extremely exciting, and hopefully removing a bit of a bottleneck for customers that were looking for, highly performant SANs. Again, we saw also on the slide some upcoming 2021 features. So if you're looking at this and it looks exciting, but you have a desire for some of these, it could be worth mentioning. We will have multi-attach, IO fencing, fast snapshot restore, and elastic volumes. So if this is something that's interesting to you, feel free to check that out, and you can expect those features in the coming year. But moving on from EBS and block storage, we're going to talk a little bit about databases, right? How could we not? We started off. There was a lot in the database space here, I would say, right? And I think that there have been some underlying changes in technology and the management of certain technologies that inspires certain services and feature launches that we saw here in Andy's keynote. you know, giving a little history here, he talked a bit about Aurora, Amazon Aurora being the fastest growing service in the history of AWS, supporting MySQL and Postgres, and at 1/10 the cost of traditional relational databases. Uh, Folks and customers use this, were extremely excited by it, but wanted the promise of being able to have some sort of serverless configuration where you can scale up, scale down, only pay for what you use, similar to what they've been able to have with other serverless offerings. And so Aurora Serverless with an auto scaling configuration was launched and released. No instances to manage. Lovely. And now we saw here in Andy's keynote the announcement of the launch for Amazon Aurora Serverless V2. So essentially, this is the ability to scale faster. So the feedback from customers was that it's great that my transactions can scale up, but sometimes if I go from little to no traffic to an extreme spike in traffic, let's say you're a retail site and you drop inventory for a particularly exciting product, like maybe a consumer GPU that people are excited about, or maybe a new pair of shoes that everyone's been waiting for. You don't want to wait, a minute or 2 minutes for your infrastructure to scale up, because that could be the entire duration of your event. You want it to scale up instantly. And so one of the most exciting parts of Aurora Serverless V2 to me was the promise of scaling to hundreds of thousands of transactions in a fraction of a second. So this, scale up time essentially becomes a non-issue in a way that it could have been prior.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is, Aurora is such a key element of our relational database story. But it's important to keep in mind that it's just one component. We mentioned earlier at the beginning of the segment that we have purpose-built databases, and that is, these improvements are happening across the board, right? It remains the case that we have a comprehensive offering of databases that will suit a variety of different common workloads. Just to give you a couple of examples, we mentioned time stream, where you have time series data. You have a purpose-built database that solves that problem now. But we also have Neptune, which is our graph database. And then we have the quantum ledger database for your immutable ledger requirements. And we have Elasticsearch for caching and rapid data retrieval. All of this to say that you don't have to make that trade-off anymore of trying to dump everything into your relational database and hoping that it doesn't fall over someday. But it does raise an interesting problem, which is that now you're using all these different databases. Uh, you have to move that data across these different stores, and you have to do so securely. And that's always been a challenge. In fact, this is one of the reasons why the relational database was invented many decades ago, was because departments would have multiple different copies of the same data. It would often get out of sync. And back then storage was super expensive, right? You talked about how much data is being produced back then. You've all probably seen the black and white images of the massive magnetic disk that stored an incredible 10 megabytes, right? But in terms of moving data across these different stores, we also had some exciting announcements. Nick, do you want to take us into those?
Yeah. So in terms of again, the data story on AWS is multifaceted, and truly figuring out what's best for your use case depends on not just storage but the access patterns of it. And so one of the more exciting ones that I think fits an underserved need was the announcement of AWS Glue Elastic Views. So for those that may not have used Glue in particular, Glue is a fully serverless ETL, extraction, transforming, and loading of data here on AWS. Now, when we're thinking about how data exists at organizations, oftentimes it can be siloed for various reasons. Certain arms of the business may have certain technical requirements, certain different access patterns, but at the end of the day, we don't want to replicate data, because then we have to we don't want to have to replicate data, because then we have syncing issues or challenges with having golden sources of truth, right? With Glue Elastic Views, essentially what this is going to enable you to do is perform sort of on the fly, fully serverless processing on that data to offer views to anyone in your organization that may need it. Again, Glue can sort of just be the glue code, as its name implies, to then surface that data in whatever form that you may want, either on an output table or however you want your people in your organization to be able to use it. But ultimately, you write a little bit of SQL, something that most folks are familiar with. You can create this materialized view, and you can either move data from one source to another. You can use this to ultimately populate sort of an end. You can move it from one table to another. You can use it as an intermediary, what have you. You have a lot of options, and a lot of the different data sources and destinations are familiar. We're talking about Amazon S3 here, DynamoDB, Amazon Aurora, in general RDS, Redshift, Elasticsearch. So we find that customers have their data in various different services. They may want one of those different or similar services as the destination. Glue Elastic Views makes that pretty simple and straightforward. Pay as you go model and ETL on the fly with no infrastructure management. So sort of does the job, gets out of the way, and Elastic Views just makes it so that it's a little bit easier to manage.
Yeah, absolutely. Very welcome tool. Anything that can really kind of make sure that your data is being migrated easily so that it's not getting in the way of your business workloads and securely is a win in my book. Now, one of the reasons why we've seen all this emphasis on data and storage is because of the explosive growth in AI and ML. And these kinds of services are fundamentally driven by the quality and the amount of data that you have available. Some people like to say that data is the new oil. Um, and it's an interesting analogy, but whatever the truth at the bottom of that is, there's definitely a lot of emphasis and need for better AI ML tools. And I like how Andy led with this idea that this is an area that is moving so quickly that we have a very hard time knowing what constants exist. And he alluded to the shifting trends in the different ML frameworks. For example, the rising popularity of PyTorch and the relatively decreasing popularity of TensorFlow. And he noted that this is such a swiftly changing landscape that over 90% of ML practitioners use two or more of these frameworks, and 60% use three or more. That's really interesting, right? I mean, that's if you think about that as a signal for a industry that is really trying to figure it out and get everything ready to move forward while moving so quickly and delivering so much critical value, it's really unprecedented.
Yeah, and there are so many reasons there's so much to unpack in the AI and ML space, and even folks that are deeply involved with it can feel like it moves at light speed. But there is so much that goes into machine learning as an entire category, and it is intertwined in development preferences, is intertwined into ops. With inferentia and trainium that we saw before, it can go as deep as all the way down to the silicon. Folks are, if you're managing your own cluster, you're used to dealing with GPUs and the drivers that go along with that, and that is oftentimes an operational hurdle. But I think one of the biggest things is and this was not something that Andy said, but I'll put my own little spin on it. Um, when it comes to the AI and ML lifecycle journey, you sort of have the baby steps, and step one, which is, let's say, getting a single experiment through to production the first time. So this would involve making sure you have your data somewhere that's accessible. Then you are able to run some experiments with training. SageMaker makes that possible. Then let's say you have some promising results. You scale that up with SageMaker. You use distributed training. You use a large number of GPU instances. And then ultimately, you can use one line in SageMaker to deploy that as an endpoint on which is again CPU bound for inference, to production, and then you can serve inferences against that endpoint. I would say that's largely 0 to 1, right? Once you've done that, you can start serving those requests. But while everyone sees that as sort of the horizon at first, as soon as you get over that hill, you start to see all of these other challenges or features that you want to implement on the other side of that hill. And I think that a lot of the launches that came this time around are really serving those needs that may sneak up on you, but once you are over the hill the first time, you understand how critical they are. SageMaker Studio was launched last year at reInvent. I think that was tantamount, because even if folks didn't necessarily realize it at the time, it was sort of the stage that all of these other features will live within, because that's where AI and ML practitioners, whether they're developers, operations folks, or what have you, or analysts, what have you, there are a number of people at the organization that may want to use SageMaker for AI and machine learning. This is sort of their one-stop shop to be able to have all of this in one place in a GUI. So, without further ado, we'll talk about the first launch on here, which is Amazon SageMaker Datawrangler. And I love this service name because when I tried to describe the challenges of AI and machine learning when it comes to ETL and data cleaning and normalizing, I just hand wave and say, it's wrangling your data. Data in a clean data set is pristine, but that's not how it really exists out in the wild. And I say, you have to wrangle your data, and this is a very fitting name. It's tough. There is no single prescription for it, and there's a lot of processing and transformations that have to be performed on your data. So features like the ability to auto recognize data types on import, the ability to recommend transformations. An example here being if a date is imported as a string, that's a really common gotcha for, let's say, time series algorithms, right? Automatically handling these transformations and the infrastructure management under the covers, again, abstracts away the ops concern of distributing some sort of transformation that you know what you want it to, you know your data is, you know what you want it to be, you just want the problem to go away. Datawrangler fits in really well here with SageMaker Studio.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have some pretty interesting features across the board for SageMaker, right? I mean, so just to zoom out a little bit, by the way, Nick was talking about SageMaker as this kind of practitioner's one-stop shop. We frame it as the ML IDE, and that's true. And that is the vision that's driving what features go where, right? And so if we talk about really quickly, SageMaker Feature Store, which is a purpose-built feature store that you can use to organize, name, share, and deploy some of these features to SageMaker pipelines. These are all kind of elements of tools that the practitioners need to do their day-to-day jobs. But we noted, and I think Andy put this really well, is that there are just not enough ML experts in the world, and it would be a shame if the value of and the power of AI and ML were locked behind that kind of level of expertise, right? And so we've always had at a level of abstraction above SageMaker. If you don't, if you don't have the staff to run and train models yourself, refine them, deploy them yourself, scale them yourself, we have a variety of AI services that are really kind of turnkey. And I want to dive into some of these. I don't think we have time to touch all of them, but really quickly, we're expanding CodeGuru to cover Python as a new language, and it now includes a feature called Security Detector to automatically detect security issues with some of the lines of code that you're writing. We also have Amazon QuickSight Q, and this is pretty interesting. So QuickSight, as you may be aware, is our visualization, is our dashboard service. You can construct all sorts of fancy dashboards to monitor the key metrics for your business. But now you can use natural language to ask it any question you want. And this is really all under the hood, right? You don't need to, you point it at your data source and it figures out like, oh, you have a table named this, you have rows named that, you have columns named this. And it just stitches it all together so you can ask some really interesting questions of it. And these are not pre-baked. There's not some predefined list of questions that it can answer. It'll try its best to answer every single one of them. And that even extends into too many new features here to really do justice here. I think we can only kind of touch on a couple of ones that stand out to us. But I mean, the one that really jumped out at me was Connect Voice ID. Anytime you've called a call center, and even just through talking to them, you hear that nice little prompt that's like, by the way, welcome back. We've identified you based on the words you said so far. No further identification necessary. That's such a great customer experience. And now that's out of the box available in Amazon Connect, our call center as a service.
Yeah, I mean, Connect alone had so many different launches, and Rob, you and I have spoken about quite a number of the launches over the last year, and every time we see another one of these launches, they seem so obvious, right? The ability to because we're all consumers of various different products and services in our own lives, and I see some of these launches, I'm like, oh hey, that makes a lot of sense. These challenges around providing all of the information that I would like the company to already have if I'm calling in from a phone number, for example. So in a way, it's like, yes, listening to customers, but also some of these are so intuitive that it's like the features almost write themselves in terms of what could come next. And so these simply all are feature value adds to that all, I guess, when taken to the extreme, can be assessed in the fact that they enable empowerment of agents to be able to have more information at their fingertips to then serve customer needs faster. People don't want to be on support calls longer than they have to, and this sort of just is a win-win for both agents and organizations that are managing them, but also customers that are looking to have resolution or get information. And there's just so many different ways that it does that.
Yeah, and I think Connect, I mean, just from we've seen a little bit of how the sausage gets made, and Connect is just one of these products that is just a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier, where you're super focused on a business problem, but you're using all these cutting edge technologies to deliver that solution, right? So here across the board with Connect, we see the team is applying advanced AI and ML techniques to kind of deliver these things like Voice Connect, like Wisdom, like customer profiles, contact lens. these are all fundamentally powered by NLP, by various forms of data processing pipelines and what have you. Um, but at the end of the day, what they are focused on is solving the problem of how expensive and difficult it is to stand up and run a call center, right? And this is one of the reasons why when you look at a product like Connect, you're like, well, that makes sense. Why didn't they build that earlier? That makes sense. I'd love that feature. You know, kind of from my experience, when you're on the other side of that, it almost feels like these features are being pulled out of you, and that results from, you know, what another overused term, which is product market fit, right? When you kind of like make contact, when that team really finds a problem that people are just like, oh, please solve this, for God's sake, please, please, please solve this. Every time you solve that problem, they're going to have the second order follow on effects of what the next problem is, right? And then they will pull that requirement out of you. And then as you're going along, you're going to nod your head and go, yeah, that, of course that makes sense. Well, once you took the last step, this is the next step, right? So I think Connect is in that situation. It's really great to see that. I think that's why we've seen Connect grow so quickly over the last few years.
Yeah, and this was not part of Andy's keynote, but for anyone, I think this is one of the most interesting facts that I had learned in the past year. Rob, this was on our show, What's Next, when we were talking about contact lens with Yasser from the Connect team. Um, Connect leverages various AWS AI and ML services. So things like Comprehend to do entity detection, Transcribe to transcribe audio to text. It is built on those same APIs that you can then go and leverage in isolation. And in many ways, you could probably imagine a way to implement some of the features that Connect would build. But Yasser actually told us that the billing for Connect and these features is cheaper with all of those underlying services built in as a consolidated service than it would be to build them on your own. So you quite literally could not go and use the foundational building blocks to build it more cost effectively yourself, which I think is amazing, right? That is being extremely laser focused on your customers and your use case and finding ways to work internally to optimize costs to get that product as inexpensively as possible to
Yeah,
developers.
absolutely, absolutely. I mean,
Well,
we've covered a lot, and I'm taking it all home again. I mean, I really want to hit on this idea of like being super obsessed about the customer, and that really kind of takes us to the industry verticals. We covered a lot of them, and Nick, did any of the highlights really jump out at you?
I think there were a lot of different examples. I think the breadth of industries that use AWS never ceases to surprise me. You know, we talked about Andy talked about automotive examples with Toyota, BMW, and Lyft all having initiatives around self-driving vehicles and being able to test safety. We saw in medicine, Moderna being able to drastically cut drug testing through simulations using AWS infrastructure. Media and entertainment, something that we may all interact with more commonly. Fox using single live and on-demand broadcast platform to consolidate that. Netflix accelerating content production and rendering with cloud-based server farms. Disney scaling up their Disney Plus video program to 70 million subscribers on AWS. And then lastly, I believe we saw, actually not lastly, second to last, we saw in industrial manufacturing some very large changes because there have been some exciting launches. So I figured we could cover all of those quickly. First up, we had Amazon Monitron, a end-to-end system for equipment monitoring to prompt predictive maintenance before failure occurs. This makes a lot of sense. It is oftentimes cheaper to preemptively service something that is going to fail rather than waiting for it to fail and then dealing with the blast radius. I think this is pretty common regardless of whether you're in manufacturing or not. But having an end-to-end process where you're having sensors to collect that data, submitting that somewhere via a gateway, storing that on AWS, and then having an application to actually monitor and view that is what we'd call undifferentiated lifting, right? Every manufacturing customer would build that on their own. And releasing that in Monitron as a managed service is something that I know most of the folks in manufacturing will be very excited about.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the area of IoT and its applicability to manufacturing, this is often overlooked. I mean, we had Dave Gitlin from Carrier talk about what it's like to build a cold chain for transporting foods and pharmaceuticals, and these are the kinds of workloads that run our everyday lives, right? This is critical infrastructure for the global economy, for healthcare, for humanitarian services, and the kinds of problems that they have to solve, like you said, are at times undifferentiated and really do not cut to the core of what the business is all about. And this emphasis on kind of delivering improvements to the industrial sector is really interesting. And I'm really glad that we're paying attention to this area so much.
Exactly. I mean, to your point before, when it comes to building tools to service this in the AI/ML space, it's often difficult to train models from scratch, not just because of infrastructure needs and knowledge, but just ML theory, right? Andy mentioned that there's been extensive desire from customers to pass data, have an AWS managed model training process that may be abstracted a bit, which we see in the top layer of the managed AI services, but for manufacturing in particular. And I think we found that here in Amazon Lookout for Equipment. And just as its name implies, it attempts to do anomaly detection for different physical phenomena that are associated with manufacturing equipment. So think, temperature of manufacturing devices, the sounds that it may be making, vibrations. These are things that we as humans actually use sort of without thinking to think, oh, that sounds a little off, or something may be going wrong. Whether it's your own vehicle or a piece of manufacturing equipment, and now applying machine learning algorithms to that same set of data in a more managed way will enable more broad adoption of that anomaly detection.
Yeah,
Um, and
yeah,
we see this
absolutely.
even further, yeah, with Panorama Appliance and the Panorama SDK, the ability to sort of, access data and video feeds and sensors that may exist already at on site, but customers may not be actualizing that data or getting value out of it to the extent that they would wish. Sort of Panorama as a device and a suite of actual appliances to deploy on their network or at their company means that you can push off some of the needs to have very intelligent, very compute intensive devices, and you can push that onto Panorama where it ingests the feeds to perform that computer vision with low latency and with the ability to not have to send all of that data over the network to the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, when we talk about some of these industry verticals, what we realize is that there are a lot of these use cases that are not necessarily well suited for a pure cloud operating environment. I mean, we've known this for a long time, but there are some customers that, you talked about some of these industrial operating environments where it makes a lot of sense to have a hybrid architecture where part of your so like you're not going to move heavy machinery into the cloud. Let's face it, right? And then you're not going to move your sensors either. But where is the line? Do you send the sensor data up into the cloud? Can you process it locally? Sometimes you have to due to connectivity reasons. And so we have a lot of forward movement in the infrastructure space. It's a funny category to put things under because so much of what we talk about is considered infrastructure, depending on what level of abstraction you're operating at. But yeah, this is when I say infrastructure, I'm talking about some of our announcements specifically related to the concept of a hybrid infrastructure that spans the cloud and your on-prem environment. And so the first thing is that here, Andy mentioned that we now have Outpost in two new sizes. One is the U1 format, and then one is kind of a double U1 format. And then we have, of course, the full rack, which is 80 inches tall. Again, I mean, this is just a matter of capacity, but you have the same hardware and the same Nitro system in all of these. We also have local zones, which are kind of mini AWS regions in strategic areas, and this has been around for over a year now. But we're announcing a rapid expansion, 12 new locations, including Denver, Kansas City, Chicago, and a few more cities. And then finally, we have Wavelength, which is kind of an extension of our edge network. So this is really kind of compute that runs embedded with some of our partners in the telco space. And this really allows you to build mobile applications, games, and other types of software that require super low latency because they all happen within the same telco network. They don't even hit an internet exchange endpoint.
Yeah, I missed last year at reInvent where we were on the floor of the Venetian and I could go and stand next to an outpost that was 80 inches tall and take a picture with it. But I think it was Andy who said that these new rack solutions are a little under 2 inches and then 3.5 inches. So we're talking pizza box size to be able to deploy AWS infrastructure as outposts in a multitude of locations. So I'll miss getting to take photos with outposts, but I don't need to see it in person to know how exciting it is as a launch.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings us right about to the end of the keynote, but we have a lot of really exciting programming coming up. Nick, maybe we should give the viewer a quick preview of what to expect.
Yeah, exactly. So, for those of you that may not have been on at the top of the broadcast, this is Keynoteworthy that you just saw with myself and Rob. This is a recurring segment where we will be recapping all of the keynotes. I believe there are 5 of them throughout the 3 weeks of reInvent. But this is not the only show that we're going to be having. We actually have here a blog post that will be the primary updated source of truth for all of the live content. So, to sort of set some boundaries here, we have the sessions, which have been pre-recorded. There will be some live Q&A and interaction there, but we have been able to wrangle, not with Datawrangler, but just ourselves, a large number of other folks here at AWS to be able to perform some various pieces of live content, right? So looking at the schedule here, today is Tuesday. We are wrapping up Keynoteworthy. We will have a variety of shows, one of which is AWS What's Next. If you have watched live streaming from AWS events in prior years, this will closely resemble something called AWS Launchpad. What we do is we try to take service teams that have recently launched a feature or a product. We take them, we get on a interview style show with them, and we dive deep on the product, motivation behind it, and trying to see a demo because we can't always fit those demos into the keynotes themselves. So we've got one of those up today with I believe this is GP3 for the new Elastic Block Store launch that we saw in Andy's keynote earlier today. Then we'll have Howdy Partner, a show based on the partner network. We're going to be talking to Cloud Health by VMware later today. We have This Is My Architecture, a recurring favorite in the from the media series team. They're going to be talking a bit about how certain organizations implement exciting services using or how they deploy their infrastructure using a multitude of AWS services. Um, we will have a daily recap in English later. We didn't have all that many sessions today, but still will be nice to sort of touch base with everybody. And then we'll have a bit of a fun one with the certification quiz show. A gamified experience where you'll be able to learn from the folks over in training and certification. If you're at all interested in exploring, just having a little bit of fun or exploring path to certification, this is a great and fun way to see that. But Rob, I think one of the parts that I'm most excited about are these recaps here, and I see that they extend the times here all in PST. But we have, I believe, 8 different languages for localized recaps, and I'm pretty sure that this is new. This is the first year we're doing this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We understand that reInvent has a global audience. AWS has customers all over the world, and it's extremely important that we offer these localized recaps so that folks speaking different languages, operating in different regions, have access to the same information as we do here. So yes, this is I believe the first time we're offering this many languages, and it's great to see it.
Yeah, and I know that again, first session of AWS on air, sort of behind us now. But we went on for an hour and 10 minutes. Each of these recaps looking to be about an hour. Again, some familiar faces. If you are used to developer advocates from your region here at AWS, you can probably expect to see them leading the interviews and the recaps here on their various in their various time slots. So again, content in the language that you want to consume it in the time slot that's conducive to you. And I believe that all of these sessions will also be available on demand. We'll have some more details as to when exactly these will be available on demand. But you can look out on this page where if you're watching, will be posted here here at AWS On Air in the reInvent platform. Cool. Well, I guess last thing to call out while we're on this page is you can, as you notice here, AWS What's Next has a little hint of what the session will be here in GP3, whereas a lot of the other sessions do not necessarily have uh, names here yet. There are a multitude of launches that are still going to be happening on an ongoing basis. So as those are launched, we will fill those in here on the schedule. So I don't mean to keep information from you, but unfortunately I have to. So this link will be persistent throughout reInvent. This blog post is on the news blog titled AWS On Air, reInvent weekly streaming schedule, and we'll be constantly updating this. But if you arise on the stream today, you're in the right place. We're not going to be going anywhere throughout the day or across the different weeks. You can continue returning here according to the schedule, and you will see maybe myself and Rob, but definitely a large number of faces across the 3 different weeks.
Yeah, awesome. Well, I think that about wraps it up for Keynoteworthy for day one, like you said, and we'll be back for the recap. So we'll see you soon.
Awesome. Yep. See you later in the day, everyone. Thanks for tuning in.
Bye.